I want to start with someone that very few of us are familiar with, Edward Tolman. Let's look at his biography and then some of his contributions to behaviorism. Tolman earned his PhD in psychology in 1915 from Harvard University. Harvard was a very popular place to study psychology. It still is today. It was just as prestigious back then as it is today as well. In graduate school, Tolman was introduced to behaviorism by Robert Yerkes, an applied psychologist that we learned about a few weeks ago, and he was introduced to Gestalt psychology by Kurt Koffka. Tolman had experiences with two, Yerkes and Koffka, of the most popular, famous psychologists at the time. These connections were certainly helpful in helping him expand his career, just as these connections would be useful today. Tolman would take these different ideas and combine them to create his neo-behaviorism, his new behaviorism. He, like many other behaviorists, really relied on the experimental method to test his ideas. Some psychologists at the time would come up with these theories, these ideas, but then they wouldn't test them. They would write about them and write about them and write about them, but never conduct the kind of high quality research that would allow them to figure out whether these statements, these ideas are applicable to most people. So Tolman was a big promoter of using the experimental method to identify the ideas, the principles that are of practical value. He studied Titchener's structuralism and was exposed to those ideas, but introspection prevented structuralism from becoming a more prominent force in psychology. Tolman did not like introspection, did not think that it met the same standards as the experimental method that was being used in the natural sciences. Tolman preferred experiments over introspection. One of the other things that I think is important to mention about Tolman, he was not afraid to be wrong. He wanted other researchers to test his ideas and make sure that the things he was putting out there were being confirmed by other people, that he was not the only one to observe and confirm his ideas. He encouraged that research cycle. He encouraged the testing of one another's ideas. Some of the early psychologists became annoyed when new researchers would publish studies in direct conflict with their original ideas. Tolman was not one of those people. He encouraged his graduate students and his colleagues to test his ideas and prove or disprove his own hypotheses. For many years, Tolman taught comparative psychology and spent a lot of time in the laboratory studying rats. At first, Tolman followed in Watson's footsteps. He promoted the same ideas that Watson had promoted. Eventually, though, he became dissatisfied with those ideas because they didn't completely explain behavior. So he came up with his own ideas. His system was called purposive behaviorism. And basically what he did, he paid attention not only to observable behaviors, the way that the rats behaved, responded, how they learned, but he also paid attention to goal orientation. He documented the goals, the motives of different behaviors. Why did rats do certain behaviors in some situations, but not in other situations? How do those situations change the goals of the animal? How does goal orientation impact how animals behave? He promoted the idea that behavior is goal-oriented, that behavior is motivated by some internal force that we can't observe, but that we can draw conclusions about by observing the behaviors that are associated with said motives. This idea that the internal impacts the external was not necessarily a new idea. He was drawing attention to yet another variable that we needed to pay attention to when trying to explain behavior. According to Tolman, behavior is the means to an end. The behavior is the way that we get certain things that we want. So we need to pay attention to how animals are driven, what motivates them, their goals, in order to understand why they behave the way that they do in certain situations. His learning theory was what we call a cognitive approach. He paid attention to these internal drives and how these internal drives impacted how the animal made decisions about how to behave. He predicted that when a task is repeated over and over again, the association that develops and strengthens, the association that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, this association includes not only the stimulus and the response, but also includes cues in the environment. So there's probably more than one stimulus. It's probably a group of stimuli that are actually eliciting that behavior. So we've got to pay attention to those cues in the environment, but then we also have to consider the animal's expectations, how the situation changes how the animal thinks about the situation. Many behaviorists paid attention to the behavior and ignored some of these internal drives. Tolman really brought the focus back on both. Tolman also introduced another important concept, one that we rely on today: intervening variables. He defined intervening variables as the things within the organism that actually determine behavior. There's a reason we behave the way we do. That reason is known as an intervening variable. We may not be able to see that variable, we may not be able to measure it, but it is in fact the real cause of behavior. He proposed several different categories of things that might actually cause behavior: environmental stimuli, physiological drives, heredity, previous training, and age. All 5 of these things, he said, are going to impact behavior. They're going to be the real reason that we see the behaviors that we see. In order to understand behavior, we need to pay attention to all of these things. We need to try to control these variables when we can through different experimental methods, through different ways of assigning groups. Sometimes we use quasi-experimental methods to study biological variables. Think about it: previous training. These animals in Pavlov and Watson and Skinner's studies, these animals were likely influenced by the experiments that they had participated in the day before, the week before, the month before. This was a really important concept to introduce and to promote. We today follow Tolman's, rules, his principles in terms of how to study behavior, pay attention to all these different things, not just the observable behavior. But back then it was a fairly revolutionary idea. So thanks to Tolman, we have very precise ways of measuring the observable and drawing conclusions about the unobservable. One of the other things that Tolman promoted was the idea that we need to separate learning from the performance of the task we want the animal to learn. We need to separate those two processes. Instead of assuming that the learning process is impacted the same way that the performance process is impacted, we need to consider how things in the environment might have a different impact on the two processes. For instance, rewards impact performance. If we give different types of rewards, rats perform differently based on the type of reward that we provide. Sometimes, though, when we don't provide any type of reward, although the rats may not perform, they may not do what we want them to do, they do still learn. They are capable of learning even though they can't perform. The way they learned and the way they performed are influenced differently by the things that Tolman identified, things in the environment, things within the animal, training, age, and the like. In one of Tolman's studies where he looked at how rats learn in mazes, he demonstrated that animals can sometimes learn below awareness, even when no rewards are present. So animals can still pick up on new information even when they're not being rewarded for it directly, and even when they're not motivated, not paying attention to that new information. In one of these studies, he had 3 different groups of rats, and he taught them how to run through the same maze. The first group never received a reward. They were taught how to go through the maze, but it took them a really long time to catch on because there was no motivation. There was no real reason for them to figure out which corridor to go down, how to get to the end of the maze. There was nothing there for them at the end. As a result, they showed very little improvement. And like I said, it took a really long time for them to figure out how to get through the maze. With the second group of rats, they always received a reward at the end of the maze. This second group that was always rewarded, they, from the beginning of the experiment, showed steady improvements in performance. When they would be tested on their knowledge of the maze, they were able to perform better each time. The third group did not receive rewards for the first 10 days. And like the first group, they made a whole bunch of errors. It took them forever to figure it out. And they usually completed the maze slowly. It took them longer to complete the maze, if they completed it at all. On the 11th day, the third group, who had not received any rewards up until this point, started receiving rewards every single time. This third group immediately showed steady improvements in performance. They immediately were nearly at the same place that the other rats who had been rewarded this whole time. They were nearly at the same level of performance. It's almost like for those first 10 days, they were learning stuff, but just had no reason to use it, had no reason to perform it, so they didn't. It wasn't until they started to receive the reward that they demonstrated their knowledge. They demonstrated how much they had learned. The same kind of thing can happen with humans. We all probably have at least one example of how we learned something without realizing we learned it. It wasn't until we were called upon to demonstrate that knowledge that we realized, oh, wow, I knew that. I didn't know I knew that, but now I know I knew that. As you can see, many of Tolman's ideas are still relevant to the study of psychology today. And there's one more idea that was important to how behaviorism developed. The early years of behaviorism were focused on these associations between stimuli and responses, stimuli and responses. The idea was that we learn by strengthening those associations. Every once in a while, someone would come along and say, there's something else. There's something else that we're not paying attention to. There's something else that we've been ignoring all of these years. Tolman was one of those people. He demonstrated with many of his rat studies that the rats weren't necessarily strengthening these stimulus response associations. They were learning the environment. They were making a map of the maze in their minds and then using that map to make decisions about how to behave. So for a long time, for instance, researchers assumed that the reason a rat would turn left at a certain doorway instead of going down the hallway and taking the next right, many psychologists assumed that the rat had memorized that motion. That doorway elicits a left response. Some behaviorists said the rats memorized the feeling of going through the maze. They remember going a certain distance and then turning. Tolman had another explanation. He said that the rats built a cognitive map of their environment.